in different time zones. So I'm pleased to be with you today. I'm going to try sharing my screen, and hopefully this works because I have a PowerPoint I'd like to use. So let's see what's happening here. Of course, I had to close all kinds of pop-ups to get to what I want. So, are you seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert. So I've entitled this presentation, The Class of Worldviews, and I will explain a little bit more about how I came up with that title and kind of one of the questions preparing this material raised for me, which became kind of the title of this presentation. I am going to say that normally I would take questions as we go along. Using a PowerPoint, it's hard to see, and being online when people have questions. Plus, I know we're limited to an hour. And if I don't get through to the end of the presentation, you kind of lose where I'm going with this and the hypothesis I'm offering for you to think about. So it is important for me to get through the material, but I have left time for questions at the end. So please jot down any questions you have or wonderings, insights, because I do work better in a conversational style. So just to begin with, the Atlantic acknowledgement that I acknowledge that I am on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And so as I read that today, I just ask you to take a moment to think about where you are situated and the lands that you are on. And I know for those of us who are local, this time of year on our land brings about such a strong reminder of the change of seasons and how our earth continues to give life, die, and give life again. And we see it in the color of the changing of the leaves. It always makes me aware of the wonder of the land and of the earth. So in looking at this presentation, and actually it was in a side conversation with Robert that kind of tweaked my interest, was in looking at the new competencies, our CAS competencies, number 4.5. Two of the points that struck me was the 4.51, to demonstrate a non-anxious presence and neutral stance in the provision of mediation and consultation, and 4.52, to act as a change agent in one's clinical setting to promote a culture of care, respect, justice, and reconciliation. And when I read those, this was before looking at this presentation, I was both pleased and excited to see these points because of what I have interpreted those to be. And so I will speak more to that in other slides. But as an experiential teacher, and as all of us have been experiential learners, I always like to start with inviting you into an experience. This is much harder to do online. So I'm just going to ask you 3 questions to think about and just to reflect upon, create that as kind of the background to everything else I'm going to say in this presentation. So the first question for you is, in your ongoing growth and self-awareness, in your ongoing spiritual journeying, therapeutic relationship, when you come to an insight about yourself, which allows for growth, how much are you excited about the insight? And how much of your energy goes to more of a negative thinking, I'm going to say, saying things like, oh, I wish I'd come to this sooner, or oh, if I'd only understood this back then. So I ask you just to get a hold of, where do you kind of, on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you fit on one of those sides? And then the second question is to think about, at some point, a class you've taken, not an academic class, but maybe it's been a class in painting, writing, drawing. Maybe it is now you're a runner. So, but some solo maybe activity. And to think of when you're engaged in that activity. So I'm going to use for me the experience of running. I just started to run since January. And how much of, so for me, the question is, when I'm running, how much am I looking at other runners and comparing their stride, their stance to mine? How much do you, when you're engaged in something, always evaluating yourself against someone else? So again, I just ask you to kind of be aware of your response to those questions, what it stirs up for you, how you respond, what are you aware of within yourself as you think about those things, what's the insight for you. So this is just the overview of the presentation. The presentation will be divided into 4 parts. Our relationship with peers and colleagues, relationship with your manager or supervisor, the relationship you have with the organization that you work within, and your relationship with your worldview. So just to set the context, this presentation is from the perspective of, from my own personal perspective of having worked in a healthcare facilities as a spiritual care practitioner. It does not speak to different settings or private practice because that's not my experience. I don't have that to bring to the conversation. The thoughts and what I'm going to present to you and the hypothesis I'm going to leave with you today is drawn from my experience. Have been a manager of spiritual care departments in 4 organizations across Ontario over 32 years. 2 organizations were faith-based. 2 organizations were non-denominational. I guess we'd say public, but all healthcare is public. I've worked with both an internal team of spiritual care practitioners in some organizations and also a large cadre of volunteers, both ordained and non-ordained volunteers. I will be using personal experiences for illustration purposes, but have removed any identifying information, and they are not even part of, like the notes aren't even part of the PowerPoint in case that is asked to be shared after. I would also ask you to, and there's a little bit of humor maybe involved, to focus on the example and what I'm drawing on, and not to play some type of jeopardy in which we are trying to figure out who and what might be the particular situation I'm speaking about. So we will begin, let's begin with our, but I'm going to say your relationship with peers and colleagues. And I'm saying your because it's my perspective as a manager and supervisor over a number of years. I think the first point I'd like to make is that your peers are not necessarily your friends. In fact, an organization does not expect you to be friends. Their expectation is that you are going to work well together for the benefit of the organization. If friendships happen to develop, that can happen. But I guess my point here is that I've often seen, sometimes seen, friendships get in the way of being a functioning department that is focused on providing the best care to patients, families, and staff. The working relationship is what is first and most important. And if that is compromised or influenced by friendship, then there's an issue there. And so the example I would give you is around staff socializing. I recall one staff I worked with would often go to concerts, symphonies together. There was a lot of personal support. But what I experienced was that the personal relationship, I wondered if the personal relationship was making it difficult to work together when projects or developing standards of practice came up and we were trying to work that out together. Because I experienced a hesitancy of sharing difference of opinion. And when I think about that, there's a lot at stake. If your social life is tied to the same group of people, it might make it hard to really, when you're working on something department-wise, to express a difference of opinion, because you might not be invited the next time. And so you lose a friendship, which creates isolation and increased loneliness. So I often, and if that's happening, then I would propose to you that we as a department are not providing the best spiritual care, because we are really, there are other factors that come into play that are hindering developing the best practice, best policy, whatever that we might be working for the sake of the patient. And so our own personal agendas get in the way of our professional practice. I think this is heightened, and I also think this is as I've said here in this slide, a drawback of a small profession like ours, spiritual care. We do share many things in common. We often come from similar values, ethics, philosophy towards life, often studied together, studied the same courses or same field of study, maybe even share similar life stories, especially those, and this is probably a historical perspective anymore, who have worked in congregations. There's a lot of shared experience there. We are a small profession department in a large organization. And often when one's a minority, there's a sense of being bonded together. We see the similarities, we see the commonality, and that binds us together in a different way than, say, nursing would. I think nurses and would see themselves as individuals as well, much more so, as well as sharing the same profession. I think the fact that we sometimes understand ourselves as spiritual care practitioners, that leads us to unconsciously assuming we share a lot of other things together. And so the experience I have is not within spiritual care, excuse me, but my experience with the LGBTQ plus community, being part of that community myself. There's a sense of shared experience, commonality, an aspect of our lives that, a major aspect of our lives that we share in common, that we've struggled with, that we've overcome, that we've celebrated. And we do come together in small communities to support and feel understood. Often it's this experience of coming home. But I also think this can lead us to forget that despite what binds us together, there still may be big differences between us. We might hold very different values, outlooks on life. And despite this commonality, this group might be people we wouldn't otherwise decide to hang out with. But we do because of that. But we get maybe lulled into the sense that we also share a lot more in common. And that might not be true. So that can create, and I'm saying that that type of small commonality can create an artificial sense of belonging. And on one hand, it creates another artificial sense of belonging. And at the same time, it can easily exclude the person who is quite different within our profession or doesn't fit the norm. And so that makes that harder for that person to continue to express who they are because they don't fit within the majority of the group. And I think this also has a negative impact on the working relationship we have with one another and the success of the department. So relationship with manager, supervisor, role difference. The first point I want to make is that the person you report to has not been hired as a spiritual care practitioner. That is not their main scope of practice within the organization. They may have been a spiritual care practitioner and maybe have been one within the same organization and get promoted to the role of manager. But when they are hired as the manager, their main role, responsibility, and accountability is not to provide spiritual care, but is to establish and maintain professional practice within the organization. I do believe it is preferential to have a manager who is a spiritual care practitioner by history or by practice and profession, because they do better understand the profession, and I think are better positioned to advocate and advance the profession within the organization. But ultimately, they are accountable to the organization in a different way. So the person they report to holds them responsible to roll out priorities, practices, goals, and objectives of the organization, and to ensure that the spiritual care department is in line with the other professions within the organization. My experience has been that this can often cause misunderstanding between the staff and the manager, especially in situations where the manager has to respond to issues related to work habits, professional practice, evaluation. My experience has been that sometimes I feel staff expect a level of compassion, understanding, or acceptance of certain situations that the organization would actually not support. So in my experience, I've had people say to me at different times, well, that doesn't feel very compassionate, or that doesn't feel very kind when I've responded to something. And I think the manager can be compassionate, they can be understanding, but they still have to work within and hold to the guidelines that HR sets, long-term disability, all those things. And I think to expect a manager, and I felt that pressure. I can't say I wasn't necessarily said directly to me, but I certainly felt this pressure of some expectation that I would lessen those guidelines or those policies in order to create a different situation for a person. And I think to do that, for me, it was to ask me to do something that I considered, first of all, unethical, and secondly, actually to put my job in jeopardy if I was making an allowance for a staff person that was beyond the policies of the organization. So I'm calling this this two-edged sword in the relationship between spiritual care staff often and the manager, the person they're reporting to. I've often said, and the two-edged sword is, as a manager, I would very much say that I would need staff who are independent, high functioning, hold themselves accountable, and have a high trust level in. Because often you're assigned to different clinical areas across an organization, and it's becoming more and more common in healthcare that organizations are multi-sites. And so the manager might be located on one site, but with cross-site responsibilities. And so, and there's weekend and evening work. And so it's not unusual for you as a staff person not to see your manager over the course of a week, or maybe once a week, or maybe not at all for a couple of weeks. Certainly not that day-to-day contact. And so the manager is relying on you to be accountable and to be reliable, unlike any other profession within healthcare. Just want to hold that for a second. Every other profession, other than maybe physicians, see their supervisor, manager on a daily basis. And so what this does is it naturally, to be that independently functioning, and that's needed, creates, I think, this false sense of accountability in which staff sometimes feel they're more accountable to the clinical manager. And then when there is need for the spiritual care manager to intervene, or the spiritual care manager actually accepts the role of manager, not as a colleague, not as a spiritual care practitioner, staff are often caught off guard, surprised. And again, my experience has been that staff often will go to their clinical manager first when there's a concern they have, whatever that be, rather than to the spiritual care manager. So I guess one of the experience I've had, like how that independence can come through, is staff informing me rather than asking of time they were going to take off, whether that be vacation time or whether it was on a particular day, maybe the day of, or even to say they would be coming in late the next day. I just want to hold to you, and I'm doing this hesitantly because it sounds like I'm bragging, but I learned it from someone I reported to. In all the years I worked, up until the last 2 or 3, when I took vacation, there was never any coverage. It was just, I was gone and people functioned if in case, and that's how it was. I didn't have to have coverage. So it didn't really matter when I took vacation because there was nobody to cover for me and I didn't have to arrange that. But I never told the person I was reporting to that I was taking vacation. I always asked, was never denied, and I wouldn't have expected it to be. But I felt incumbent upon me to ask. So much so that I did that before I booked flights and travel arrangements. And again, in my experience, I've actually had staff, when they've told me that they were going away, kind of expressing a little bit of hesitancy because, let's look at coverage. And the response was, well, I've already booked my flight and my accommodation, so I have to go. So I just hold that out to you. Relationship with the organization. Any healthcare organization is hierarchical. It's not collaborative. It might be consultative, but it's not collaborative. This is true for the manager too. The manager works within a hierarchical situation, and in relationship to the person they're reporting to or the organization, they don't have a collaborative role. And so a lot of what the work of the manager is to carry out what the organization or higher ups in the organization decide. So the VP or director, whoever the manager is reporting to, a good director or VP, and I reported to good ones, luckily, all my career. Well, actually, there was one exception to that, but that's a side comment. Really does not micromanage the department or the manager. If they do, it doesn't work well, and I think they're misplacing their role because they have oversight on a much higher level. Many programs, many departments, and they have many managers reporting to them. So they're not concerned about day-to-day operations. I remember years ago having this insight and working with a VP, and after months of meetings, realized, monthly meetings, I came out with all the work to do, and she went on to something else. And it struck me, I thought, well, at first I thought I was a little bit angry. I thought, well, isn't she going to do some of this? And then it struck me, well, no, that's really not her role. That's my role to carry all this out. And I thought, in some ways, the higher you go in the organization, the less day-to-day rolling out work there is to do. So the VP, the role, so that in reporting to a VP, what you're taking to a VP is you are communicating how you understand the department being in line with this particular goal of the organization, this objective, how you're updating policies, practices, procedures, according to the new practices and procedures that the organization is rolling out. And oftentimes I think staff don't realize that as the manager, you're kind of like that middle person. That's why they call it middle management. And you're often the person that's stuck with implementing. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it, but that's my role to roll it out. And I never felt that it was good management, good philosophy, good for the sake of the department to say, well, I don't really agree with this, but we have to do it. I felt that was divisive. And so often the manager ends up hearing the resistance to something and actually kind of agreeing with it, but not being able to respond to that because they have to hold in their role to supporting the organization. Also, when it comes to staffing concerns, it's not really the role of the VP, that's the role of human resources. So if you have an issue with your manager or the person you report to or concerns, you could certainly go to anybody in the organization. But I think it's the VP that's going to, or the director that's going to refer you to human resources um, to resolve the issue. Again, because they really don't have time to get into such nitty-gritty or frontline issues. One of the kind of philosophies I've always used in the people towards the people I've worked with is that I would take them anything I felt they needed to know, or that I wanted them to know before they hear it from somewhere else. I never wanted the person I report to be blindsided. And I would hold that out to you as well in your relationship with your manager. You know, you need to be, I suggest that you take to them whatever you think they need to know, or in the likelihood that they might hear something from someone else, you want them to hear it from you first. It's always easier for me to say to my VP, well, this is what I've heard about this. I will check into it, more so than saying, oh, sorry, I don't know anything about that. So with those components, I'm going to move to what my hypothesis is. And I see I'm doing good for time. That's great. I am talking a little bit fast, but that's okay. So I'm going to invite us to engage in what is one of our skills, is our spiritual reflection, and the integration of our held spirituality with the practice, with our lived experience. If we hold a pre-modern or modern worldview or theological paradigm, when it comes to conflict with such a view, there is an ultimate right and wrong. Something is good, something is bad. And this is known as a reductionist paradigm. So if you go back to the first questions I asked you to think about, you might have a sense of the paradigm you hold. If, you know, in the first example, the insights to your self-awareness and self-growth are, oh, I only wish I'd come to this sooner. That's the good, bad, the right, wrong. You know, as I'm running, I'm looking at other people's stance and how they run, and I think, oh, I wish I could do, or, oh, am I doing that right? You know, to have started running at the age I did, I think to run anywhere at any rate is good, but no, I compare myself to others. So that comparison and the conclusion of right or wrong is that reductionist paradigm. I'm positing for you today that that's not the worldview or paradigm of large corporations or business healthcare corporations. In the face of conflict, the organization first stance is not about finding out necessarily, unless there are some exceptions, ethical, legal, but if it's really around relationship, their first stance is not to investigate who's right, who's wrong, to condone the one and to dismiss or reprimand the other. It first stance, and often the long stance, is what can we do to help the two of you work better together? That's the stance of the organization vis-a the relationship between the manager and the staff person. But it's also the expectation that that's how the manager is going to deal with conflict amongst staff as well. Is not about figuring out really what's the ultimate truth. Again, a pre-modern stance, depending how one understands truth. But it is about, okay, how can we help you to continue to work together? How can we build this relationship? How can we help you work together? Not about one of you is right and one of you is wrong. And so I'm suggesting that this is maybe what is often at the heart of attempting to resolve issues amongst spiritual care practitioners, or between spiritual practitioners and the spiritual care manager. In my experience, the staff person doesn't appear to be looking for what we can do to improve our working relationship, but rather somehow report me to the person I report to, or want to prove right or wrong. And so I'm often have wondered if that understanding is what gets in the way of someone being successful, really, in the organizations we work within. And so I'm going to share with you two examples that I think that for me illustrate this. And one is working with HR and a staff person who was on a performance management program. And when you're going through a performance management program, when there are issues, you're talking about a process. If it is going to lead to dismissal in any form, you're talking about a process that's a year to a year and a half long. And I've been involved in those processes. What is also surprising, is if it comes to termination or dismissal from the organization, obviously that's going to come as a surprise to colleagues, and it should. To me, if it's a surprise to you that your colleague was let go, then that says that the supervisor, the manager did their work well because they held confidentiality. But in this case, going back, there was a lot of tension. And this was often expressed by the staff as disagreement with me and criticism of me. And in one meeting, and this was quite an insight for me, the HR person said that one of the difficulties with spiritual care, when there is a tension between the supervisor and the staff person, that in other professions, they would just merely move the staff person to another unit or to another reporting structure, because there are multiple units or departments of the same profession across the organization. And so they simply move the person, and then they monitor to see, does the problem continue? And that gives them an idea whether it's really the issues are around the staff person or with the manager. But the HR person, with spiritual care, there's one manager across the organization. And so that's not an alternative. And so the alternative is to try to work things out together. And so it was a real insight for me around the importance of being able to work things out and not to have to prove one person right or wrong, and how unique we are, because the other alternative of moving somebody's placement and have them report to somebody else is not an option. The other experience was having a staff person go to a VP I reported to, and that's fine, and sharing their displeasure with a decision I had made regarding a request they had made, and continued. So they went to express their concern about that decision, and also, but went on to talk about how they felt I had created a toxic environment in the department, and went on to other things as well. And at the end of the conversation, the VP said to the staff person that they would speak to me and hear what I had to say, and then that the three of us would get together and talk about the situation. And to that suggestion, and of course the VP is relaying this to me after, the staff person responded by saying, "No, I've told you the problem, now it's yours to deal with." To which the VP responded, "That's not the way I work. we will get together and talk. And so that was a searing for me, a very searing example of how two different worldviews were colliding. One in which there's a right and a wrong, there's the problem, you go fix it. And the other one is in which we are working together on this. So sorry, I'm just checking my notes. So that's the end of the formal presentation. What I can do is I can stop sharing the screen, and then we can have a conversation. You can raise your questions. I can see those of you who want to be seen, and if you don't, you know, obviously you're not being seen. So there we go. So comments, questions. Does it relate? Does it touch anything in you? Does it speak to anything? Or yeah, do you totally oh my goodness, what's the word I'm looking for? It's working from home is not always the best. If you disagree.
Hi, Mark, it's Andrea.
Oh, hi, Andrea.
Thanks so much for that talk. I really appreciated your frank and kind of honest appraisal of what it means to be a leader in spiritual care, and then and sharing some of your own experiences. I appreciated the highlighting of some of the skills that we have as spiritual health practitioners are transferable maybe to leadership skills, but could also be requiring someone to draw on different parts of themselves that are not as strong in order to be a good leader. And in fact, there are a skill set there that's different than some of our spiritual care competencies, or around listening and relating, establishing an alliance. There's times where you have to be, like as you talked about, just clear, firm, and that may be different, drawing on a different skill set. So I appreciated hearing about that, and that's the way it is. There's a culture in senior management and leadership, and you have to learn the culture and then be able to speak their language, so to speak. And the world, and thinking about it as worldviews too is also helpful. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Just to comment on that, yeah, that's very true. You know, but it's also true in different professions too. So my husband is a elementary school principal. I don't know of a principal right now within education who hasn't been a teacher. That's their qualification, but they don't get any, like, their education has nothing to do with being a principal. It's about teaching. You know, when I did my MDiv and spent my first 14 years in congregational ministry, my MDiv, and didn't always do it well in every area, educated me to be a pastor. That was a priest, like to provide pastoral care, congregational care, not to run a parish. I remember the first time I was a pastor, and I had in this rural area and had 2 graveyards and all of a sudden I was chairperson of 2 graveyards. I didn't know anything about running taking care of a graveyard. So in spiritual care, it's the same. Our education, and it can't necessarily, because that's not the primary role, doesn't prepare us, educate us to what it means to be a manager, to run a department, to management skills. And so I think we need to learn those. I was lucky enough to be in organizations that very much supported that and offered all kinds of opportunities for that. But just to go back to, you know, what we can talk about within our profession, our spiritual care identity that informs us. When I became a manager, that's a different spiritual care identity. When I went from being a clinician to a supervisor, that involved a different spiritual care image. You know, I remember as a provisional working with Floyd Green and Jan Kraus. Some of you, probably many of you don't know Floyd Green anymore, sign of generations, but Jan Kraus, and talking about spiritual care image. And I said, this just isn't working for me, this spiritual care image I'd had as a practitioner, you know, and I kept trying to use it in teaching, you know, and she said to me, well, why are you hanging on to it? I said, well, because it's worked for 12 years. And she said, yeah, but this is a different role. This is a different identity. You need to find a different spiritual care identity to inform your practice. And so I think, Andrea, it's a long way of saying there are two aspects: the skill of being a manager, but also a spiritual care identity that informs the role I need to take on.
Hi, Mark, it's Tim.
Hi, Tim.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for sharing. I'm following up on what you just said and sort of the different identity needed, and just curious about whether or not it's ever possible for somebody to function in a role as both manager and clinician simultaneously.
Well, I think it is. I think it is so I would say that I functioned as my career went on and I took on more responsibility. I did less patient care, but I would say I functioned as a spiritual care practitioner vis-a-vis the organization for corporate things like services of remembrance. I functioned as a spiritual care practitioner visa doing what we called at UHN Lavender Alerts or staff debriefs of major events. The one that comes to mind, I won't go into it, but they were really tragic things. They weren't the average patient death. It was, horrible things on a corporate level. A physician charged in the death, the murder of his wife, that type of thing, and debriefing staff. I do not believe that you can be the spiritual care practitioner for the staff that are reporting to you. That's a dual relationship. Very much so. The others can be dual, but it's a different, there's degrees of separate, ethical degrees, I think, or separation that creates a different ethics. But I think the dual relationship of providing spiritual care to staff is untenable, and I think unethical. And I just want to be clear, when I say staff, I mean spiritual care staff.
Yeah, I hear you.
Colleagues.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, Mark. It's Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Really appreciated your talk today. And I have my educator hat on. And I've always sort of, since I've been teaching, wondering how we can actually prepare the students who we have to be better employees, because that's the other side of this, right? Is many of the students we have come from church backgrounds or maybe non-traditional corporate jobs. And so they have never experienced working in a corporation and what that means. And how can we better prepare the workforce, really quite literally, to the corporate expectations?
Excellent question, Linda. I don't have the total answer for that, but I certainly think there would be an opportunity there within the SPE experience to do didactics, maybe even a course, on the whole philosophical understandings of organizations, how they operate, to have human resources come in, present, do presentations to students, just to be very clear about what the expectations are within working within an organization. I mean, you can't do everything within an academic degree. And I think as people move into, okay, what's their stream, where they're going to be, then there is opportunity to upload different knowledge that's needed.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think SPE hasn't been so great at that piece of it. We do the practical at the bedside skills, but the other stuff is just as important.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we help them with.
Yeah, even more important, you know?
Yeah.
So, and I think as my experience, especially having taught residencies for ages, there is that, I mean, I've experienced that, scratch my head thinking, what are we going to do for a didactic, you almost have like, 48 weeks of didactics. So there's all kinds of, things that could be loaded into there that help. And that's why I was excited when I saw the new competency, because I said, to me, that's what those 2 bullets were talking about. I thought, finally, we're talking about educating people with the skill they need to be successful within an organization, like a business organ, to have a business acumen that helps them be successful.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. But I think that's something that as educators, we have to start to talk about and how to build that in. For our
Right.
students.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. I see there are 2 hands up, and it's hard for me to monitor the size of the number of people. So if anybody wants to,
Lydia and Steve Robertson, maybe Lydia first.
Oh, thanks, Robert. Thanks for monitoring.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thank you, Mark, for your talk. I really appreciate it. And I have a question, and I don't want to project on you to answer it personally if you want to answer it more just generally, but I really appreciated the insight on if you come from a religious worldview, it can be very Manichaean. How, either in your personal experience, again, you don't have to speak to it personally, but how does one unlearn that? What are some tools to help with that? Because it can be that dualistic thinking, right and wrong, is very hardwired.
Right.
And it can be a deconstruction process, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just what are some insights or wisdom that you have in that of how to unlearn kind of that presumptive way of, this is my first reaction to particularly conflict resolution?
So my first response, Lydia, kind of at the end, is to say, having been a person who was raised in a church with a very pre-modern, it never goes away. And when I get stressed, even as though I'm retired, retirement's raising some issues, personal issues for me, and I'm realizing I'm back to that reductionist thinking of right and wrong. So my first example of insight, that was my own experience in the last few months. I think first is awareness, to really be aware that I hold that perspective, and how does that, therefore, if I do, or even to say, okay, if I do, how might this be influencing my relationships? I think for me, a couple of the examples I shared were really strong influences for me. It made me stop and think about that, like the different paradigms and what was happening here, like, and it does, I have to admit, some of it is hard earned, like on your shoulders. You don't always, I didn't always have that insight, but, after you deal with enough conflict again and again, you kind of think, it allowed me to pause and think about, well, what's going on here? What might be going on? I think your own spiritual journey, for me, part of it was my own spiritual journey of realizing that, the paradigm I was working out of, sorry, cats love Zoom. Hey, Alessandro. It was getting a hold of that spiritual care, or that worldview paradigm I had, and then being able to see how that could create conflict for me. Does that help at all?
Yeah, thank you. It's a journey, as you say. It takes
Yeah.
it takes.
But you know, good. I guess too, I had good colleagues within organizations that you know, they certainly didn't talk about worldview paradigms and all that, and spiritual paradigms. But listening to what, you know, made them successful or how they understood organizations, having some great mentors as people I reported to, you know, helped a lot too.
Steve Robertson, are you still there? Thunder Bay.
Yes.
You had a question? Or your
Yes, I
hand?
am. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, sorry. It's kind of going sideways on me here, but hi, Mark. Sorry, I came late. We were just in a meeting with our manager talking about just this. And sorry if I missed my question.
That's okay.
But we're trying to promote spiritual care in our facility. I'm just wondering, what is the best way that you found to create a culture within the administration to call upon your services?
Whoa, that's a huge question. So one of the points I guess I forgot to make was, I think one of the best ways to create a culture within an organization is to see yourself as any other staff person within the organization. And what that means for me, there is sometimes a culture that exists within our profession that we are special. We do special work. I would say we do unique work. But there's a lot of other people within any healthcare organization that does a lot of unique work in different professions. So, you know, and I think sometimes, and I've seen this play out with departments and staff that I've been part of, they want to be part of the organization. We want access to charts, we want access to patients, all that. But then we also want to be treated special when it comes to asking for time off, for how we work, for the hours we work. That two-sided coin does not bode, I can tell you, does not bode well with organizations at all on a senior level. So if you're dealing with that in an organization, you've got to wrestle that one down. And then you function like every other profession in the organization, and that will eventually get up to senior management, because there is a reporting structure that exists. The other thing, Steve, is I'd say look for opportunities in which you have to be proactive at the beginning, in which spiritual care can say to the VP, that's a situation that we can help you with. And you provide some spiritual care on a systemic level, and that helps promote within.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone online for joining the conversation today. We're at the top of the hour. Any last questions, comments for Mark before we have to sign off? Now's your chance. Okay, we recorded the session. It will be available. I'll send out the link to anyone who wants it.
Good.
And again, we thank you, Mark, for your time and the insights today. A very informative conversation on leadership and career development in spiritual care. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate connecting with so many diverse members in our association and even beyond, reaching over to Ireland as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert. It was good. Thanks for the invitation. I actually enjoyed kind of delving into this a bit. So there was insight and new learning for me. And thank you everyone for listening and participating.
Wonderful. And to everyone online, just a reminder to please tune in next week when we'll continue the conversation with George Hanso from the Healthcare Chaplaincy in New York. The title of his talk is How to Be a Chaplain Leader. And we'll be meeting an hour earlier than we normally do on Wednesdays. So next week from 11 to 12, George Hanso will be online and available to take your questions and comments as we continue this conversation. All right, until next time, thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Cheers, Mark.
Bye now.
Thanks, Robert.
Okay.